And God, for the gift of this community, we give you thanks. We're thankful for your grace. We're thankful for your love. We're thankful for your presence. God, may you speak to us through your word today. In Jesus' name, amen. Many lifetimes ago, I remembered reading a book for my senior worldview seminar class entitled Truth is Stranger Than It Used to Be: Biblical Faith Within a Postmodern Age. It is written by G. Middleton and Brian J. Walsh. Some of the key points that the book raises are: in order for Christians to be effective, we should not have an attitude of judgment as it stands against the culture. They agree that whatever claims to the uniqueness that we like to make, we all need healing, which only comes by understanding the current times and culture. They suggest that only by listening sensitively and empathetically to the cry of the age will Christians be able to discern the contours of the emerging postmodern worldview. As Christians, we are called to embody a story that is larger than ourselves, and to call attention to that story, especially within the times in which we live. I believe that there are two ways as Christians that we can live: with a mindset that the God in which we serve is a village God, or the God we serve is a global God. To see God as a village God is to be insular within the way we think, understand the gospel, and what it means to be a Christian or good gospel carrier in the time in which we live. God is a global God. And so this message of hope that we have been so entrusted with, Christ in us, the hope of glory, it is a message not just simply for a few of us and no more, but this is a message for the entire world. The question for us to consider is: how do we live out our faith authentically in our contemporary culture? How do we avoid consuming the culture so as it does not consume us? Brian Walsh and Middleton suggest that we need a way of thinking about the practical implications of our faith that is consonant with the Bible. The Bible, they argue, is a universal truth that we need to know, understand, and embody. Instead of standing outside of the biblical story in order to interpret and apply it to our lives, we need to indwell or inhabit its story in such a way that it becomes our normative plausibility structure. More than ever, as believers, we are called to listen empathetically to the critique of Christianity and of the world in which we live. We must have sympathetic ears to the thoughts people hold and the struggles which they contend. There are lots of issues presently affecting our world, and so as believers, it is important for us to internalize the principles of scriptures and understand how believers in the Bible or earlier times apply the truths of the Gospels to issues and problems that confronted them in their culture. Apart from the harsh realities of our time in which we live, I want to say that I do acknowledge that many of us find ourselves in a place of loneliness, disillusionment. For those who are new to Canada, I'm aware of some of the struggles and the challenges that come with living in a new or unfamiliar place. There are so many things to navigate: language, culture, food, custom, times, and at times the values. The key is to always remember who you are. I want to remind you that you are loved, you are chosen, and you are called. Today we are going to reflect upon a kind of integrity or allegiance that Daniel and his three friends had, an unshakable faith in strange times. We're going to see how they carefully and thoughtfully looked for ways to maintain their relationship with God while living and working where God had placed them. They did it. they thrived. No matter how antagonistic the culture or the world around us gets, we can and must do the same. Follow me as we read the first chapter of the book of Daniel. I know that most of us, we have heard most recently messages from Pastor Eddie and Pastor Susan about this particular text. The third time, I'm hoping, is charm. Today, I'm hoping to come at it from a slightly different angle. I believe that there is something that God might be saying to us within this time, especially as we focus on what it means to live as the people of God in the world and for the world. Daniel 1:1-6. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his god Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his god. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing ability. Young men without any physical defect, aptitude of every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter into the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Sheshach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. In reading this text, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar, he devised a plan to use these 4 boys for his glory. The question as we look at this is God, the question, as we look at this, is if God is not using us, then who is? You see, God has a plan, but the devil too has a plan as well. And so it's either we are following God's plan or our own, or the devil's. Daniel and his friends were between ages 14 to 17. And so Nebuchadnezzar's plan was to brainwash these young boys and to get them to turn their minds away from the God of Israel. Notice he asked for the best: educated, have wisdom, good looking, no blemish, must be poised so that they can stay in the royal court. These young boys found themselves living in a strange land in the midst of a king who was planning and devising how he could accomplish this mission. In Egypt, from a historical standpoint, the children of Israel, they were whipped. They were forced to hard labor. Here in Babylon, it is different. These boys are treated nicely, and the king also had quite a generous bonus package. They had free lodging, free clothes, free books, best food, the one in which the king himself eats. They also had free wine, free university education, training in language, magic, and science. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah won't have to worry about job or job security. They were to be given a job in the king's court upon completion of their training. The plan also involved renaming them after their gods. The benefit package sounded too good to be true. It is very important that we analyze what we hear, and it seems this is exactly what Daniel and his 3 friends did. They recognized that not every promotion or benefit package comes from God. It is so important that we do not forget who we are or lose our sense of identity. These young boys were given names by their parents that represented the God they serve. These boys' parents would have reminded them constantly of their identity. Parents, we have a responsibility to our children to remind them who they are and whose they are. The question for us to consider is who owns us And what name or names are we going to accept? Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah's parents would have taken them to the temple and offered them up before God, recognizing that they were mere stewards of these precious young lives. This past Sunday, my family and I, we attended the baby dedication of our niece, and I was reminded again of this act as my brother-in-law and sister-in-law took the oath before God to raise their daughter in the fear and the admonition of the Lord. You see, these young men parents would have instilled in them that there is one God, like the Shema that they often recited. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. The foundation that we lay for our kids and our parents lay for us, it matters. When we find ourselves in crisis, who we trust matters. They were called idol names, but they refused to live in that identity. As part of the assimilation process, they were renamed. Daniel, which means God is my judge, to Belteshazzar, protect the king's life. Hananiah, which means the Lord is gracious, to Shadrach, command of Aku, a god. Mishael, which means who is like God, to Meshach, who is like Aku. Azariah, which means the Lord has helped, to Abednego, servant of Nego, a god. The biggest function of this exercise was to strip away the identity as children of the Most High God, or El Elyon, and replacing them with new Babylonian names. The problem for us is that we usually skim through these verses so many times that we usually overlook them and jump to other preferred applications, and we miss really what's going on. We focus on two externals in particular. Daniel rejected Daniel culture, the Babylonian culture, and so should we. Or two, Daniel rejected a meat and wine diet for vegetables and water, and so should we. The truth is, however, Daniel and his friends was much more worried about their name, which represented their relationship with God. A lot of very careful thought went into their decision, and if we want to apply this structure to our lives, we need to understand what they were doing. People call us things, make us believe this is who we are. Don't allow people to define who you are. Don't allow your sickness, your age, your circumstances to define you. The question is, do you still love God? Do you still have a passion in your heart for Him? They continued to read through the package and they recognized there was some clause. They realized that there was a strong possibility they could be eating food offered to idols. They made a decision. We are not going to eat that food. We are going to remain resolute. We know who we are. The hardest part of being a young person today, these young men faced it. Daniel and his friends, they were young. They were young Jewish boys training to enter the king's service. They rejected the diet they were offered because of their conscience. I'm wondering, what would be the hardest ways for young people to maintain their Christian integrity in the working or non-working world, be it school or university? The biggest challenges to young people today is more ideological than behavioral, based on studies. In one psychologist's book, iGen, Why Today's Super-Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, the author agrees that the great exposure to social media has led to poor mental health, and that greater emphasis on tolerance and inclusion has actually caused them to be less tolerant, more fragile. But she also says that more young people believe that the economy is rigged against them, which has sapped their motivation. In 2021, there was an article that was published by New York Times entitled, "What It's Like to Be a Teenager Now." The winners of our Coming of Age 2021 contest, which is a compilation of viewpoints from teenagers which reflects on isolation, discrimination, conformity, internet, anger with older generations, fear of people who think differently, depression, tribalism. Topics and attitudes that seems to have come straight of an activist playbook, except they're from 13 to 14-year-olds. There was nothing in the article about truth, conviction, religion of any kind, nothing about eternal perspectives, grace, or compassion, which might actually be more of a reflection of the New York Times and not so much the entries. The point I'm making is that Christian youth face the same challenges that we as Christian adults face, except they do it as teenagers. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they had to navigate a cultural war. And with their careful, their thoughtful approach is something that is useful to all of us. So what do we know about Daniel? We don't know much about Daniel to this point, but he was clearly from a noble family. But what he's now renowned for is he never gave up his faith in God or the relationship with God. The Babylonians conquered a people. They took the best, the brightest of the youth, both to improve the king's court and also to brain drain the conquered people. Daniel and his friends would have been surrounded by bright, strong, good-looking young men from around the empire, like Google headquarters, except at gunpoint. Something that we see as this story unfolds is regardless of major world-shaping events, God is the one who is actually in control of human history. This is especially relevant of the current times in which we live. Further, Daniel and his friends serve as proof that God's people can thrive in any culture without sacrificing their relationship with God. In verses 8 to 10, we see a commitment expressed. Daniel determined he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. And so he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned you food and drink. What if he sees your face looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. Daniel and his friends were to become Babylonians, so they could serve the king well. This included learning the Babylonian or the Chaldean language and wisdom, and also adopting the Babylonian culture. The king graciously fed all of these exiles from their own table in preparation for their royal service. One of the things that we see is that they did not reject Babylonian culture. They still learned the language and the customs. They still learned the literature. They became familiar with the Babylonian ways of thinking. And this is how Daniel in particular was able to rise to so high in ranks. And that was not unique to Daniel. Consider this letter that Jeremiah sent with the second wave of exiles in which Pastor Susan preached a sermon on. This is what the Lord of the armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles I deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses, live in them, plant gardens, and eat their produce. Find wives for yourselves, and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons, and give your daughters to men in marriage, so that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. Pursue the well-being of the city I have deported you to. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for when it thrives, you will thrive. Jeremiah 29. Settle down in Babylon. Make a home for yourself there. Remember that many Jews decided to stay in Babylon rather than to return to Jerusalem. These boys, they were also not rejecting meat and the wine diet. Meat and wine were common in Israelites' eating. This was the centerpiece of the Passover meal. By the time we get to Daniel 10:3, Daniel himself eventually adopted the royal diet of choice meats and wine. So what was Daniel trying to do? He was trying to figure out the very same thing we are: how to be in the world, but not of the world. He was asking the same questions that we should be asking. How can I fit into this new community setting? How can I succeed in the tasks that I've been given? How can I distinguish myself for future advancement? How can I do all these things without compromising the fundamentals of my identity as a Christian, and in their case, as a Jew? A lot has been made of Daniel's plan for eating, but let's take a look at Daniel's thought process. Daniel did not know how food was prepared. For all he knew, they strangled the animals to keep the blood in. Daniel did not know if the food was sacrificed to idols, and so for him, he was concerned about his perception in the court. How about us? Do we care that what we do or engage in might bring shame or reproach on the God in which we confess? Daniel may not have not known what all the foods were that they brought to him, but the list of clean and unclean foods was very clear as to what he knew that he should and shouldn't eat, based on Deuteronomy 14. Daniel was looking for what he could still control in his life. Changing his name was intended to be the ultimate display of control. We give you a name, we give you a job, we give you a culture, we give you an identity. I think a lot of careful thought went into his decision. Rebelling against his clothes would be too obvious. Rebelling against his language and learning would be counterproductive. Himself as a faithful Jew, Daniel had no qualms with that meat and wine. But here at first, he was not going to take in any more of Babylon than he had. Note how respectful he was about it. He had worked hard to develop a good relationship with the chief official over him. He cared about him. He knew that he was doing his job. And he wasn't trying to be ungracious toward the Babylonian court, who was feeding him and educating him. The king's official was worried about appearances. If the king thought that the official was improperly feeding these young men, the official could be in trouble. Daniel did not want to get him into trouble, and so he came up with a proposal. Here are some points for us to reflect upon. We are constantly consuming the culture in which we live in. How do we know when we've consumed too much? Certain parts of our culture are unavoidable, but what can we control? What parts of our culture can we choose not to consume? We have more control than we think. We can't prevent our eyes from seeing things. We can't help having to purchase goods from certain places. We have to know what's going on in the world enough to be a good employee. As Martin Luther famously said, we can't prevent a bird from flying over our head, but we can prevent it from nesting in our ear. What of the culture we currently consuming that isn't healthy for us or isn't possible for our walk, profitable for our walk with Christ? Here's a test pass. Daniel 11:16, it says, So Daniel said to the God whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our parents and the parents of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. And so he agreed with them. Daniel's rebellion wasn't primarily about meat and wine. He had consumed choice meat and wine as a noble Jew, because they all did. For Daniel and his friends, this was about carving out space for them to establish their own unique identity, and more importantly, giving God that space to work. From verses 17 to 21, we see a recognized difference. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding, every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind, and at the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them no one was equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they began to attend the king in every matter of wisdom, understanding that the king consulted them about. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians, the mediums in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Through a secular evaluation of Daniel's plan, they conclude that the diet is what made the 4 Jews wise. However, we know that God was the one who made them wise. God made Daniel and his friends supernaturally wise. Eating vegetables will never help us to interpret dreams. He also enabled them to become experts in Babylonian wisdom. Wisdom was very important in Babylon. Babylonian documents 1,000 or more years older than Daniel are found with proverbs, religious myths, and dialogues. In just 3 years, Daniel and his friends became experts in Babylonian languages, history, government, politics, and perspective and wisdom. Do you think this is something that you could do? After the 3 years, the official whose name was Ashpenaz presented them to the king, and they outshined everyone else the palace had trained. It was obvious to the king, who had no love for Jews per se, that these 4 young men were vastly better equipped to serve him than anyone else, and this could only be attributed to the act of God. We learn in later stories that other advisors were jealous of Daniel and his friends and looked for ways to get them into trouble. But their personal integrity, when highlighted by God's miraculous intervention, always convinced the king to land on their side in the end. As God followers, we can thrive wherever God plants us. So the challenge is to apply this to our vocational call, our place of employment or study. Our boss, hopefully, won't ask us to interpret a prophetic dream, but we may be able to offer a kind of wisdom that proves better than the worldly wisdom that is being used. As believers, young, not so young, we need to seek the leading of the Holy Spirit to apply the biblical principles that we have internalized. The gospel, the good news of Jesus, has the universal good for all people in mind, and so should we. This message is for us and to the ends of the earth. God, give us an unshakable faith in these strange times and make us by your Spirit good gospel carriers for the glory of Christ's name. Amen.